So the talk today is going to be about a specific question, but it's a question that's been framed by this research project that I've been involved in that Kent mentioned, the ReSDA project, Resources and Sustainable Development in the Arctic. So in the presentation today, I'll talk first of all about this particular project, and then I will talk more directly about the subject that I have for today's talk, since that subject is directly related to the research that's being done by the ReSDA project. But as Kent pointed out, the Resources and Sustainable Development Project it's a social science project, then just social science and social scientists and historians are involved in this particular project. And it has a very, very simple objective, is to look at ways to try and increase the benefits that northern communities get from resource development and to manage any costs and eliminate any costs. What's interesting about the project is that it emerged in a very sort of strange manner. I have to start out by mentioning that since the 1970s, most social scientists working in the Arctic, if they're talking about resource development, and in particular extractive resource development, most of the time they're talking about the negative impacts that come from these types of developments. There has, since the 1970s, been a focus among social scientists on trying to determine the negative impacts that arise from mining and oil and gas development in the Arctic. And that focus really arose from the 1970s Berger inquiry, from the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline inquiry, because it was during that particular inquiry that the communities themselves at that particular time talked almost exclusively about the negative impacts that they saw extractive resource development having on their particular communities. So this has been something. So in myself, I've been working with communities for the first 20 years, primarily in Northern Ontario, and then the last 10 years, primarily in the territorial North. And during those initial 20 years I was working in Northern Ontario, you're going to these communities, you talk about resource development, and it got to a point where the communities were saying, well, yeah, it's nice to have you come and talk about resource development. Can you try and be a bit more positive? They once referred to me as Dr. Death every time I came in because I always accentuated the negative aspects of it and how terrible life was going to be. But that really was because from the 70s till about the 1990s, that's what communities were focused on. Because for them, and for those of you who have some sort of knowledge or remembrance of the Berger inquiry, the communities were very concerned that they wouldn't be able to control the development processes that came with extractive resource development. So they weren't saying that we're certain that the impacts would be negative, but they were saying is that based on our history, based on our experience with resource development, they're going to be negative if we can't control the situation. And so that was the focus of the Berger inquiry. As we all know, Thomas Berger submitted his report in 1978. And after that particular report, oil and gas development, or at least pipeline development in the north, was put on hold for a period until the land claims, which had been mentioned in the Berger inquiry, were settled. What happened in the 1990s was that social scientists who started to deal with, who were dealing with resource development impacts in the 90s, started to notice that communities were less hesitant or less fixated on the negative aspects of resource development. There was a new confidence that was starting to emerge in certain regions of the Canadian North anyways. I can only speak from Canadian North because that's what I had the most experience with in the 1970s, or in 1990s. There was a new confidence which started to get communities thinking about resource development in a different way. A post-Berger inquiry vision of resource development. And for those of us involved in the ReSDA project, this emerged in a previous research project that most of us who are involved in the ReSDA project were involved in, called the Southcott project, the Social Economy Research Network for Northern Canada. And this was a research project that was trying to look at alternative economic development for northern communities. From 2006 to 2011, we went to a series, we hosted a series of workshops in various communities across the Canadian North to try and get the communities talking about, alternative resource or alternative economic development for their particular communities. It was during those discussions that, that we as social scientists started to notice that the idea of extractive resource development as a solution to certain economic, social, and cultural problems started to emerge. And it was from those sort of comments and statements that the ReSDA project first emerged. That you took a team of social scientists who, by their nature, were opposed to extractive resource development around northern communities because it was going to have a negative impact, to a situation where this group of researchers were now prepared to look at what positive aspects and under what conditions could positive aspects from resource development occur for northern communities. So that was sort of the background for the ReSDA project. And sort of to list, this is a sort of a summary, or I summarized in some of the comments that were made during these workshops to show you the sort of the new attitudes that communities. This is a summary of different statements that people made. So, can we find ways to use the land so that our sons can find jobs, stay here, and have hope for the future? There's very much a concern in the community workshops that, especially for young men, there's very little hope. There's no jobs. There's nothing for them to do. They don't have the money to go out on the land to pursue traditional activities. And so the communities were starting to say, well, we have a new situation now that we have our land claim. We have Nunavut, in the case of Nunavut, which gives us self-government. Can we start looking at ways that we can supply jobs to our youth? Another type of comment, we don't have much else to build a healthy community on other than natural resources. It's difficult to say no to mining, but can we do it in a way that helps us to continue to exist rather than kill us? So the realization in these communities was that mining in this particular case can have a lot of negative impacts on their communities. But there's also the potential that can have positive impacts if they can control it. And another idea, another sort of statement, climate change research money can't keep our communities alive forever. We need to have a serious look again at what we can do with our natural resources, i.e. there's very little opportunity for money from outside coming into these communities other than from transfer payments and from certain types of research, so that we now need to look. If we are going to become sustainable and less dependent upon transfer payments, we're going to have to look at extractive resource development. So these are some of the statements that led to the development of the ReSDA project. ReSDA was developed then to respond to these community questions about whether resource development could be done differently, given that there were new land claims, agreements, et cetera. And so, the belief summarized in the ReSDA logic, if you will, is that because, unlike previously, the land claims that the Berger inquiry, for example, said needed to be recognized and settled before industrial development took place in the north, they have been, in most instances, settled. We have new co-management systems whereby northern communities have a say in the management of the environment, and so have a say in controlling any impacts on that environment. We have this new ethics that exists around resource extraction. People around the world now know that mining companies can be a very terrible thing on local communities if it's done in a way that doesn't respect basic human rights. And so that's different from the 1970s. We have a better idea of what the economic, social, and environmental impacts are of mining and oil and gas development on communities, something that was just starting out in the 1970s. Social impact assessment had barely been created, the term, in the 1970s, when Berger, for example, was looking at the question. And we have this new world respect for Indigenous rights that exists. That means that companies, international companies, have to look like they're playing nice with Indigenous communities. So we have all these new issues that hold the potential for extractive resource development occurring in a way that benefits northern communities. And so that's the basic idea behind the ReSDA project. So what exactly, precisely, is ReSDA? ReSDA is a project that currently involves about 54 researchers in 29 universities in 9 different countries. We have core funding. We're an MCRI project, which no longer exists, but it's Major Collaborative Research Initiative. So we have funding for 7 years, from 2011 to 2018. And in fact, we have the possibility for renewal for another 7. So the project itself could continue until 2024. I've already mentioned several times the focus of that particular research. In terms of where, this is just a map to show you the different locations that ReSDA researchers and research projects exist. If you're interested, this is all on our website, which you'll see the address for at the end. But I just wanted to show you a bit. We have stuff as well in Siberia, but it didn't fit on the map. Okay, so when we started out, the first thing we wanted to do was to find out what's out there already. It was sort of a question that, for many of us, it was a new approach. It wasn't a new question, but it was a new approach to the question. And so we had decided to do a series of gap analyses. And it was done in conjunction with our community partners. The main forces behind, some of the main forces behind the ReSDA project are our main community partners, which are like Inuvialuit the Inuvialuit Regional Corporation, Makivik, Nunavut Tungavik Incorporated, and other Indigenous organizations in northern Canada. So we had a series of projects. These, I'm not going to go through them all. These all have reports now that are on the web that are outlining the gaps that are sort of a literature review and outlining the gaps for the different areas of, in terms of impacts, resource revenue sharing, community industry relations, impact benefit agreements, the subsistence relationship between resource development, subsistence economy, gender issues, et cetera. So these are all on the web. These were finished in 2012, and since then we've started a series of research projects, or we call them sub-projects, 15, that are currently being organized. Most of these projects are based in Canada. We are, in fact, an international project, but most of the partners, the community partners that are on the steering committee for ReSDA have stated that what they prefer is that we spend our money on Canadian research and then try and get partners in other areas to compare their research with our research, and so that's what we've done. So once again, you know, I'm not going to go through all these 15 projects, but with the Inuvialuit, for example, we have an indicators project. They really wanted to develop a system of indicators. There's been a lot of work done on indicators. So they wanted to sort of get all that work together and see how those indicators, the work that's been done, can be related specifically to measuring the impacts of the oil and gas exploration booms that they go through periodically. They've sort of given up, I would say, on development booms, but the exploration booms that go on periodically they wanted to look at. Fiscal linkages. Lee Husky is an economist at the University of Alaska Anchorage, is looking at the fiscal linkages and the way where money goes nowadays in terms of Arctic mining and oil and gas development. The ways that financial benefits within communities are distributed. This is something that when we had a workshop in Whitehorse, several communities say, well, you know, we're starting to get money. Before, we never used to get money from these mining developments. Now we're starting to get money from these mining developments because the companies realize, you know, that it's either on our land or that they have an obligation to share the financial benefits. What's the best way of dealing with this money? And so Thierry Rodon from the University of Laval has a project comparing the different ways that communities feel about distributing. Some communities give it out to individuals, take money from research projects and give it out in single disbursements to individuals. Others put it into community funds that can be used for community projects. And so they're comparing these different, so Thierry Rodon is comparing what the communities think about these particular arrangements. Problems with impact benefit agreements. Ben Bradshaw at the University of Guelph has got a project looking at how to move beyond the current impact benefit agreements. Can we arrive at a situation where we don't need these impact benefit agreements? There's something universal that can be established that companies and communities can share. What are the best ways of building educational and training capacity from resource development projects? This is another project we have. What do communities want in terms of well-being? This is the project that Kent worked on when he was at Lakehead. But that's actually a project that's led by Brenda Parley at the University of Alberta. She's looking at what communities think of well-being and what sort of well-being that they would like to come as a result of resource development. Okay, that's all I'll talk about. There's a whole series of projects. These are all described on our website as well, and sort of a background. Not all of them are finished, but if they're finished, the final report, there's about 4 or 5 that have final reports. The rest have reports on progress. Okay. Okay, so let's get to the actual question, the research question that we're looking at. So I think it's not a surprise to everybody that we've had over the past 15 years or so a fairly rapid increase in interest in resource development in the Arctic. Up until, 2008, but really up until 2011, we had a massive number of exploration and development projects relative to what had gone on the previous 20 years occurring in the north. So it was this particular sort of intensive development that gave rise to the concern that communities had that led to the development of ReSDA. While we're right now at a low point in development, I was just 2 weeks ago, I was at the Nunavut Mining Symposium where the mining companies stated that they were at the bottom line, that this was the worst it was going to get, and it's going to be like this for a while. Most people realize that over the next 30 years, there's going to be increased interest. Gold mines, for example, in Canada's north have not slowed down because of the decrease in commodity prices that we've seen over the past 8 years. Gold has been continuous, and we are going to build on that in northern Canada. So we have all this new interest. Now, what's sort of unfortunate for the communities is that at a time when they have all this interest now from mining companies, at least. We had, starting in the 1990s, all of this research that demonstrated that those communities who depended upon resource development for their well-being, for their sustained economic development, were doing the wrong thing. You know, we had all of this starting in the 1990s. A series of economic studies based on econometric analysis noted that all of those locations that depended upon extractive resource development for their development had poor economic performance than those regions that didn't have extractive resource development. That means to say if you're lucky enough to have minerals, oil and gas or minerals, if you're lucky to have that, you're going to suffer economically because of that. And there was this whole series of studies that were done, and it was quite a topical question in economics and other social scientists because of the seeming contradiction between the fact that if you're resource rich, you're going to be economic development poor. And so there were this series of discourses that developed all around the idea of what's become known as the resource curse, which, living in Alberta, this is something probably that you've heard many times before, so I won't, since you all live in Calgary, I won't need to talk about the resource curse too much. But it's sort of, it was sort of new to a lot of the social scientists that outside Canada, people start to recognize that economic development based on extractive resource development was problematic. It wasn't new to many Canadian social scientists, however, because for years, people who looked at resource development in northern Canada recognized, and this was even prevalent during the Berger Inquiry, Mel Watkins and others during the Berger Inquiry, the Berger Inquiry pointed out that, you know, in the north, you're not going to benefit by resource development. And the reason why, however, was not because of the resource curse. That term hadn't even developed in the 1970s, but because of this, this problem linked to another model which had been used in Canada for many years called the Staples model. And that is the Staples trap, is that in northern Canada, most of the benefits, at least most of the financial benefits from resource development tended to leak out of resource developing regions, especially those regions that were in the north. When they leak out of these regions, then you don't have the added capital to have what they refer to as backward and forwarded linkages, backward and forward and final demand leakages to develop and diversify your economy. So when that happens, you get stuck in what's called a Staples trap. And you continue to be dependent on oil and gas or mining because of this Staples trap. So these two discourses then are what make up, obviously, the title for this particular talk is how to avoid the trap without being cursed. So for the rest of the talk today, I'll talk about these two discourses as they apply to northern Canada. Oops. So just to compare these. So to compare the two theories, first of all, the Staples trap, the Staples trap occurs when benefits leak out of the region. So there's under normal, according to the standard classical liberal economic model, benefits, normally if you have a particular profit, that profit, if it stays in the region, it is a linkage which helps to develop another type of economic tool. When I talk about this in Lakehead University, I give the example of Minneapolis-St. Paul, which used a staple, wheat, to develop a diversified economy, because Minneapolis-St. Paul had very few leakages, that most of the money from the early wheat boom went back into the economy and provided linkages, backward, forward linkages, to develop Minneapolis-St. Paul into a diversified city. But if the people who live in the region don't control that development, then the financial linkages leak out. So growing up in Northern Ontario, virtually all of the pulp and paper industry that was developed in Northern Ontario starting in just after World War I was developed by American corporations whose benefits, financial benefits, left the region. And so there were very few linkages from that particular development to turn places like Atikokan or Kenora or Dryden into diversified economies. So, 110 years later, the city of Dryden is still a pulp and paper town dependent only on pulp and paper because all of any potential linkages were leaked out. So in most Staples theory, the most important benefits tend to be the resource rents. These are the things that tend to be accentuated in discussions of the Staples model. The resource rents, the super profits that come with extractive resource development. And so when these don't stay in the region and they leave the region, then the regions don't develop according to the classical liberal model. Just to add a thing is that one thing we're doing in the ReSDA project is seeing that you can use that leakages type of model, but not restrict it to financial linkages or leakages. You can talk about capacity linkages or leakages, or cultural capacity linkages or leakages. So while previous Staples model theorists tended to accentuate financial linkages, the Staples model can be used for a whole series of linkages. Of course, then you have the resource curse theory. As I said before, it was developed, first of all, in the 90s by econometric observations, primarily of countries in Africa or Latin America in a so-called post-colonial environment. That once they had been given independence, then while previous to that you could say that, well, things didn't go well whenever there's extractive resource development, but that was because of colonialism, that the mean colonial power, grabbed all the money and left nothing for those particular countries. So once you had independence in a new post-colonial situation, you should have extractive industry developments helping diversify the economy. And they found out that in those countries that had the highest reliance on extractive industry for their economic development, they had the biggest economic problems. There was first of all was to point this out. Then the question, that was pointed out in the mid-90s, that several organizations pointed out several times that this, when you run the numbers, it always comes out that extractive industry dependence leads to poorer economic performance. But then you had to explain that because econometric analysis doesn't explain that very well. So there's a whole series of explanations that come with the resource curse discourse to explain why those countries and those regions that rely on extractive industry development do so poorly, economically speaking. Well, one explanation is that when you have all this wealth coming in from extractive resource development, you have no need to worry about the future in terms of educating your people. The idea is that education suffers because the logic sets in that you become a rentier state, that you'll just live off this money that's coming in. You don't need to worry about education. You don't need to worry about building educational capacity in your particular region. Another explanation is that high resource incomes kill diversification. So if you have, for example, in the oil and gas industry, everybody's making all this money, it's very difficult for the people to develop industries in other sectors that can't pay that type of money and remain competitive. So that's linked to the so-called Dutch disease theory, which is also linked to currency evaluations. But I won't go into that particular aspect. Another one talks about the fact is that when you have all of this money, the so-called flexible income going around, the super profits, it leads to high levels of war, violence, and corruption. And so this war, violence, and corruption that comes with super profits tends to result in poor economic performance. And then, of course, you have the fact that if you're relying on something that Alberta knows all too well, is that when you rely on certain extractive commodities, these commodities go through boom and bust cycles in terms of pricing. And when you have a boom, things are going well. You often don't put money aside for the bust. But when you have a bust, you have a lot of economic development problems. So these are just four of the main explanations for the resource curse. Why, when you're as a region depend upon extractive resource development, why you have poor economic performance. Generally, however, the overall, there's sort of about 5 years ago, a consensus started to develop that the overall best reason to explain all this, however, is poor institutions. Meaning that if you have poor institutions, then you're going to have all these problems. But if you have good institutions, you can avoid problems of corruption. You can avoid problems of not properly planning for bust periods. You can avoid ignoring education if you have good institutions. And of course, that meant, if you have developed countries' institutions, then you're going to do well. If you have sort of post-colonial institutions, then you're not going to do very well. So this is the sort of the logic that sort of develops. So looking at, in particular, at the resource curse, how does Canada's North, how does it relate to the resource curse? Can we talk about Canada's North as being suffering from the resource curse? Well, no, generally what the ReSDA research has shown, and this is mostly research by Ken Coates, who is an historian currently at the University of Saskatchewan. What Ken Coates has pointed out is that the North is lucky from one, he says North was not lucky overall, but from the point of view of the resource curse, it doesn't suffer from the resource curse because it didn't have the money. It didn't get the money that causes the so-called curse. So in many respects, a lot of the aspects of the resource curse that post-colonial countries in Africa, for example, which is, of course, the archetype of explanations for the resource curse, that doesn't occur in Northern Canada because we never got the money. People live in Northern Canada didn't get the money in the first place. The fur trade money, the people, there was not a lot of corruption or problems because of the fur trade, because the money didn't stick around. The whaling really didn't benefit, at least financially. The mining money, from the Yukon Gold Rush, for example, didn't stick around, at least not much of it. And so, in many ways, the North hasn't been cursed because it didn't have, there was no way for it to capture the resource rents. Because it's the capturing of the resource rents that causes the resource curse, according to many of the resource curse theories. Okay, that was then. But we're now in a situation where we have new land claims, where under these land claims, a lot of the land that exists belongs to Indigenous communities. These land claims also mean that in other aspects and in other manners, these Indigenous communities can control the development processes for these for mines and oil and gas. Under this circumstance, then the potential for the resource curse happening in Northern Canada comes into being. We have this new control of land, which means that they can demand a fair share of the super profits that come from resource development. They can if they own the land, then they can ensure that the royalties flow directly to their particular community. Under impact benefit agreements, it's recognized that these agreements serve to ensure that the community gets some percentage of the super profits that are developed from their land. And in addition, companies, in order to get social license and other necessary goodwill with communities, enter into profit-sharing arrangements. So these are new possibilities which create the potential for the resource curse. So the question then becomes, is this, the fact that we now have land claims, the fact that we're in a situation where Indigenous communities can now, in theory at least, access a much larger share of the rents from these resource development, does that represent a problem for these particular regions? Are they going to be cursed? Well, if we look at the case that's the oldest case in the north of a region that has had some sort of control of their resource development, and to see what the impact of that control on their resource development and whether a resource curse developed, is you can look at the case of Alaska. Because Alaska, of course, Alaska became a state in 1959, which gave them the power of being a state. And then the Indigenous communities in Alaska got ANCSA, the Alaskan Native Land Claim Agreement in 1971, which, though imperfect, as many as the communities will point out, gave them a certain measure of power over resource development in their regions. So, So look, if we look at the case of Alaska, and first of all, what's interesting is that even within North America, in sort of regions that are supposed to be somewhat different from a post-colonial environment because they have good institutions, we see that most research points out that the resource occurs in North America. This is research by Goldberg, who is an economist, an American economist. He takes all the 50 states and he tries to see the per capita gross domestic product based on their dependence or capital income based on their dependence on extractive industries. And what you see generally is that the more you depend upon extractive industries for your economic wealth, the poorer you are. So that's the regression line you see, is that you tend to, the higher dependence, is all of these tend to have a negative regression line. The one exception is this dot way up in the corner, which is Alaska. So it just so happens is that the one northern region is the biggest exception, or the biggest outlier, as Goldberg and others have referred to it as an outlier, an exception to the rule. So, but is it an exception? Others have pointed out that it's not. Alaska is not an exception, but it's there because they have, from the very beginning, proactively viewed their natural resources not as private property, but as common goods. That's the term the Alaskans use. There was Wally Hickel used to use the term the commons. That's what Wally Hickel, the former governor of Alaska, used to use, the commons. So while Alaskans, you gotta love Alaskans because they're the most free enterprising people. They believe in private property and the protections of private property, except when it comes to extractive resources. Extractive resources belongs to everybody. And then they're the most strident socialists when it comes to that. So the Alaskans are the biggest socialists when it comes to extractive resources. And so that's what they did with the oil and gas industry, is the Alaska Permanent Fund, which is that fund which many of you may know, the fund that was created to soak up the super profits from the oil and gas developments on the North Slope, which is used to also, pay Alaskans every year. Every year, Alaskans get a check from the Alaska Permanent Fund. They pay no state taxes, income taxes, and they get a check from the Alaska Permanent Fund. I think last year was about $2,000, wasn't it, Kent? It was about $2,000. About $2,000 a year is what they get. Every man, woman, and child in Alaska gets $2,000. So, there's the Alaska may be an example of a way that the North, other regions of the North, can ensure that they get their fair share of resource benefits, but not fall to the resource curse. As I said, ANCSA was a project that was the first. Well, first of all, it was, as I said, in 1959, it became the first region in the circumpolar North that had its own, apart from Iceland, that had its own national or its own autonomy. The most advanced form of autonomy and self-government when it became a state, Alaska. And then you had the ANCSA. And then they have this notion of the commons, which resulted in these sovereign growth funds such as the Alaska Permanent Funds and other funds that exist in Alaska. It's not just the Permanent Fund. And then you have the example of, if you look at Alaska, what's the jurisdiction in the world where the indigenous peoples have the highest quality of life relative to the other people, relative to the non-indigenous peoples? And it's in Alaska. It's in the North Slope. So the North Slope Borough, which is not an indigenous borough, it's a municipal government, but 85% of the people living on the North Slope Borough are Inupiat. So it's effectively an indigenous government. It can be considered the most successful indigenous government in the world. Other people have looked at the Red Dog Mine as another example. The Red Dog Mine in the northwest Alaska, which is a mine which is controlled, which is owned and controlled by the regional indigenous native corporation. So these are all examples. And from Alaska, we have these examples of new linkages. I think close to this day last year, the former mayor of the North Slope Borough, Charlotte Browers, stood up in front of the American Senate, and she stated that any attempt to diminish oil and gas or to constrain or hamper oil and gas development on the North Slope will result in the destruction of our traditional subsistence economy. What's interesting about that is during the 1970s, you had time and time again indigenous peoples in Canada saying any attempt to have an oil and gas industry would destroy our traditional subsistence economies. But on the North Slope, they have a very healthy traditional subsistence economy because of the wealth that comes with the oil and gas development. Now, there are problems in Alaska. Corruption is a problem in Alaska. Some of you may have heard about the problem that Alaska had with corruption around oil and gas money about 10, 15 years ago. And Charlotte Brower, the person I was just quoting, recently lost her position as mayor of the North Slope Borough for what many people consider corruption. So corruption is an issue, but does seem that it's dealt with rather quickly in Alaska when there is an issue. Okay, and just to look at it, I wanted to compare the North Slope and statistics. If you compare the North Slope in terms of statistics to Alaska, you see that in certain instances, there are still differences. But if you look at income, if you look at even education the levels of education, they're very close to the non-Indigenous population. And you don't get that in other areas, at least in North America. So I just put in my own region in Northern Ontario, whereas in the North Slope you have high school graduation rates of 86%. In my regions, for on-reserve populations, it's under 50%. And so you have, in terms of university degrees, you have almost 15% of the Inupiat in the North Slope who have a university degree. In Northern Ontario, on-reserve communities, it's less than 3%. So Alaska does seem to present hope that it may be possible to avoid. So where does this come from? Why does this potential exist? Well, as I've already mentioned, but I'll go over in a more systematic fashion, you have these new constraints on leakages. That there is more of a chance that Indigenous communities, so there's less of a chance that these communities will get caught in the Staples trap because there are new constraints on leakages. We have this general ethics that exists, this what Anthony Giddens calls global cosmopolitanism, which states that most people in the world believe that Indigenous populations should get a fair share of any resources that are developed on their land. So as a result of that, we have impact benefit agreements, we have profit sharing agreements, we have a whole range of issues. We have modern comprehensive treaties that give them the legal capacity to control, or the legal right to control resource development on their lands. We have new forms of backward and forward linkages that are in the minds of the communities themselves. The communities themselves know that if they're going to have a mine development, one thing they want out of that is they want to have programs which will include that will increase the educational capacity or the training capacity of their particular community. Not turning people into miners, but to have some sort of program that when the mine closes down, they'll at least have people who have that increased educational and training capacity. You have final demand linkages. You do have jobs. I mean, jobs help. And jobs tend to help people in communities from a cultural perspective as well as an economic perspective. You know, if you look at places like Baker Lake in Nunavut, you have an increase in what seems to be an increase in subsistence harvesting because people are making money and they can buy the equipment that allows them to go out on the land. Now, this is sort of a contradictory issue because in some perspectives, if you're working, then that time that you're on the job takes away from subsistence activities. But if you're not working, you don't have the money to go out on the land anyways. So it's that sort of basic contradiction that there's that basic catch-22 that exists. So what they've done, for example, in the Red Dog mine in Alaska is they've structured their employment around subsistence activities. So people can take subsistence leave. They have a given amount of time that they can take subsistence leave to go on. So that way they try and deal with the positive aspect, meaning that people are making money so that they can go out on the land, and dealing with the negative aspect, meaning that there's time constraints because they're working, they can't go out on the land. Okay. So, and then of course we've talked about there's new fiscal linkages. People can use these new sovereign wealth funds, such as the Alaska Permanent Fund, to ensure that the money that's made can stick around to benefit future generations. In terms of being barriers to being cursed, one of the big things that we have in Canada is that it's not individual ownership. Most communities prefer collective ownership. So collective ownership of wealth. And this is something the Rodin research that we're looking at is communities prefer sovereign wealth funds so that you don't have the situation of individuals enriching themselves to the extent that exists elsewhere. You tend to have that from employment positions, but not from the money itself that comes from these particular projects. You do have a legitimate institutional base that exists that has come about as a result of new self-government arrangements and land claims. You have a genuine concern for educational benefits that exist in communities. So the idea that all of a sudden they're going to have all this money and they're not going to worry about education is, I think, it could happen, but most communities state that before we do anything, we have to ensure that our communities are going to benefit by increased educational capacities. We have a more balanced use of fly-in, fly-out workers. Fly-in, fly-out workers, communities recognize, are not necessarily a bad thing, not necessarily a good thing. But if you have a proper balance of fly-in, fly-out, then you can avoid a lot of the negatives that come with the boom and bust, but still have jobs locally during that boom and afterwards. So we have a project, Gertrude Saxinger, who's actually at the University of Vienna, she had done a FIFO project in Siberia about 5 years ago, and now she's doing for ReSDA a project in Canada. You have barriers to corruption in place. Corruption is an issue, and it continues to be an issue. It'll probably always be an issue, but there are certain barriers in place in Canada. You have a relatively stable political environment. All tend to present obstacles to the resource curse. So the possibility exists, in other words, if I'll summarize now, the possibility exists that resource development, extractive resource development, can be done theoretically, at least in theory. It can be done in a way that benefits northern communities. At the same time, 30 years of researching the negative impacts of extractive resource development in communities makes one be very hesitant about being too over optimistic. There are dangers that remain, and this is shown up in a lot of the research. And probably the biggest one is if communities can't control the situation, then social suffering will increase. We see that problem between the areas that have the so-called historic treaties, the provincial norths, and the territorial norths, or those areas that have the new comprehensive treaties. The areas, Northern Ontario, my region, mining tends to lead to increased social suffering because the communities don't have the control of the situation. The historic treaty gives them no power over resource development, or at least very little power over resource development in their region. So as a result, these developments tend to increase social suffering, which is not the case to as great an extent in those areas that have modern comprehensive treaties, where there's a greater sense of control. And even just having that sense of or belief in control is more important, is important. So communities, if it's going to, for something good to come, for communities to benefit, they have to have the ability to say no. If they don't have the ability to say no, then the likelihood of avoiding negative impacts is not going to be very good. There are going to be negative impacts. Capacity is an issue. It's one thing to say that they have the right to do all these things. It's one thing to say that land claims give them a right to control the situation. It's another thing to say whether they're able to do this. It's that if they simply don't have the capacity. When mining companies come forward and they have their consultants put forward their perspective, we're in a situation where the communities now have a legal right to counter that. But do they have the capacity, same capacity as the companies do? Well, most of the time they don't. Sometimes they do, but most of the time they don't. So that's an issue. Culturally appropriate institutions still need to be developed. Conflict within communities is still a problem surrounding resource development. Perceptions of corruption still exist, especially around IBAs because they're confidential, and that confidentiality often leads to local feelings. It's more of an issue, I think, in those areas of historic treaties as opposed to the modern land claim experience, but the perception is there. But then again, that's a positive. Communities are always on guard against corruption. That's something that communities are always looking for. And there are people outside their community who are looking at potential corruption as well. And then there's the dependence on a non-renewable resource. Is that, that's another danger, is that all of a sudden you have, places like Baker Lake, things are going well now with the mine. the mine's supposed to shut down in a couple of years. The idea is that you can't, that mining is non-renewable. If you want to have long-term sustainable growth, you're going to have to try and find out how to use those short-term non-renewable benefits to enhance renewable resource benefits. And that's all I'll say at this point. Thank you. Our website, www.resda.ca, has all our reports and whatnot. Thank you.